In this part of the lecture, I want to start by apologizing for the fact that I am mainly concentrating on the United States and the West more generally. This is due solely to my lack of knowledge beyond those borders, and I would be glad to hear from those of you who live in another country or culture. The first part of this lecture was a description of what it was like in ancient Israel. The second part, a critique of our own attitudes to work, may be controversial. Therefore, this entire lecture is entirely optional. You can completely ignore it or disagree with me, and you will not be penalized in any way. Now, in modern critiques of the Bible, the evidence for the differentiation of women's roles in ancient Israel has been taken as an indication of the oppression of women and a sign of unjust inequality. Now, there is no doubt that there were occasions of injustice, as in every time and place, but I would argue that the difference in work, or in roles more generally, is not necessarily a sign of injustice. The fact that it seems unjust is due to a number of cultural and philosophical changes that have taken place in the last few centuries. In what follows, I will explore some of those changes and hope to show that there did indeed arise conditions that led to dilemmas and frustrations for women. At the same time, I want to argue that some of the ways we approach women's equality are destructive in the long run. These are large problems to which I do not have the remedies, but I wish to raise some questions and suggest new ways of looking at our modern situation, particularly in the West. Now, when we look at the ideal in the Bible, we see that the basic human unit is man plus woman, and by extension, the household. Work is done so that the household might survive and thrive, and for service to the community. Indeed, there is a concept of work for the healing of the world. And the center of economic production is predominantly the household. With the modern climate, with various philosophies, economic changes, the sexual revolution, the basic human unit comes to be seen as an autonomous individual. Indeed, one who sort of in a state of nature exists totally for themselves, and who has to give up various freedoms in order to exist in community. The reason for work is often seen as the fulfillment of the self and a sense of achievement. And the center of economic production is the marketplace, the public square, everything outside the household, and almost no economic activity takes place within the household. So, how did this come about? First, we have to look at the effects of industrialization and technological change. Now, in farming communities and towns in ancient Israel, work was shared, but to some extent differentiated because of reproductive roles. And it was largely centered on the household. This same pattern continued up through the Middle Ages. The kinds of work performed could change depending on whether a family lived on a farm or a town or a larger city, but it remained shared economic productivity by men and by women. Most professions in Middle-Age Europe were organized into guilds or trade associations. Some guilds were restricted to men, some allowed both men and women, For example, butchers, ironmongers, shoemakers, hot food sellers, bookbinders, goldsmiths, etc. And some were restricted to women, brewing, spinning, and silk making, for example. Most work took place in small workshops or in the context of the household. For instance, a woman might spin wool while her husband made shoes within their own cottage. With industrialization, tasks that had been done within the household gradually were performed in factories. Women's roles, particularly for the middle and upper middle classes, became narrower as economically important work moved away from the household. Industrialization and the concentration of work in factories and corporations also meant that men were less involved in the household. We will look at the next slide, a quote from Dorothy Sayers writing in 1947 that expresses some of this. The growth of the suburbs made the situation even worse, in that women were often isolated even from other women. And the rise of feminist movements could be seen in part to be an attempt to restore women to economic productivity, which was a legitimate need. As I said, writing in 1947, Dorothy Sayers, who was a Christian writer and a friend of both J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, was lamenting the fact that while on the one hand men were saying that the role of women was in the home, much of the economic productivity had been taken out of the home. Here she is talking about England, medieval England, for example, and she talks about how the fact that the spinning industry, the dyeing industry, the weaving industry, catering, brewing, distilling, preserving, pickling, and bottling, bacon curing, and a large share in management of landed estates had all been taken out of the home and put into factories. At the same time as these changes were arising, individualism was becoming more dominant in the West. In individualism, the basic unit is the individual who has a right to freedom and self-realization and has precedence over the state or the social group. There is a tendency toward self-creation as opposed to tradition or socially determined behaviors, and an emphasis on autonomy, self-reliance, and independence. If in this view, the basic unit is an individual with the right to self-determination, women are going to seem disadvantaged because of the realities of pregnancy, childbirth, breastfeeding, etc. Equality for women for some then involves the idea that women's lives should not differ from men's lives in any way. In other words, a genderless humanity. All jobs should be open to women, and women as a whole should make as much money as men as a whole. In other words, equity of outcomes. This individualism is, unfortunately, an adults-only, even a younger adults-only arena. It ignores and marginalizes those who are, because of their very young age or old age, necessarily dependent. The ultimate outcome of this is legalized abortion on demand, assisted suicide, and even euthanasia. In regard to abortion, for those who believe that the only way women can be considered equal is if they have full autonomy and self-determination, then having a child will necessarily be seen as an obstacle. Individualism is also an illusion. A household is a place of mutual support where everyone works for everyone else in the household. The so-called independent single life, in reality, depends upon an army of other people to make life possible, whether for growing food, preparing food, building homes, providing utilities, making clothes, educating children, etc. Another problem is that the individualist rejects the past, since he or she does not acknowledge the role that parents and others have had in bringing them to adulthood, and they reject the future when he or she kills the child for whom they are responsible. A biblical anthropology, on the other hand, as we have already seen, sees the basic unit as man plus woman, and by extension the household. One is born into a network of relationships and interdependence. One is never autonomous or completely independent of others. Family is an essential part of one's life. In ancient Israel, nearly everyone married. In the history of the church, one might remain unmarried, as Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 7, but one is still part of the household of God, the church, at a very minimum. The vocation of man and woman, given at creation, is to have children, work, and rest, and act as stewards of God's creation. Life is a kind of dance of mutual obligation, care for the other, and the receiving of care from others. Responsibility is key to a good life. I do not like to call this collectivism, which is what is often contrasted with individualism, since there are limits on what is due to the group as a whole, and the individual does matter. For example, land distribution in Israel was not communal. Rather, each household unit had the right to its own property. So how might we get past this impasse where we have, on the one hand, all economic productivity outside the home, with men, women, and children all spending most of their time away from the household? How do we see past this rampant individualism, which sees independence and self-determination as the only option? I believe that as Christians, we need to have a sense of recovery of the household and men and women as cooperative partners rather than competitive rivals. There needs to be shared participation of women in economic life that takes into account children and the family. Participation of men in the life of the household is extremely important. Fathers are greatly needed in our culture. Economic productivity in the sphere of the household would be a great thing, and a move away from a corporate industrial model, which would be much more humanizing. And perhaps we need to evaluate productivity in ways beyond the monetary wage. And ultimately, we need to see human life as centered in God and community rather than the self.